electric vehicles in parking garages. Some of them are extremely heavy where they can cause structural concerns. We're mostly talking about high rises, multi-story garages. We're going to try to dive into what the choices are for associations that currently have garages that if they pass laws or if there's an uptick in these heavy vehicles, they're going to have a problem. As an example, a Tesla truck with the charging station can weigh up to 10,000 pounds. So there's a considerable structural issue here if everyone starts parking these vehicles in parking garages. So insurance companies are going to be looking at this in the future. The other issue with them is also fire. If an association is put on notice by an insurance company or even advised that a structural inspection is required, how would the association go about determining who could or could not park their electric vehicle in the garage?
I mean, absent any regulatory or statutory controls, the association would always have an obligation to maintain and preserve the common elements. So if it had reason to believe there was an uptick in the weight of vehicles, being housed or parked in parking garage, it would have to engage an expert to do the calculations to see if there was any danger.
Or maybe they have a finding that the garage is not structurally sound to hold a large amount of these vehicles. Here's another aspect. The small electric vehicle does not weigh any more than an SUV truck, though. This is where it gets complicated, where you just kind of have a blanket statement about electric vehicles. Would a blanket rejection of electric vehicles not be considered discriminatory? This almost seems similar when we talk about dog breeds.
Discrimination itself is not necessarily illegal. It's only certain types of discrimination that have been made illegal. The only control on the association in this regard would be to have a reasonable rule. And a reasonable rule would be, I think, akin to what you see on bridges and other things that we utilize in our daily travels. Sometimes you come upon a bridge and it says no vehicles weighing in excess of X pounds can use the bridge. You would simply have a rule that prohibited any vehicle, regardless of how it's powered, that weighs in excess of X pounds from being in the garage. That would almost assuredly be enforceable.
For some high rises, parking off-site is not an option. How is that going to play a role in this? Or is this just going to be, look, you have this vehicle, you just can't enter the garage, it's your problem?
Well, if there is an actual legitimate provable concern that the garage can only support so much weight, then a rule that prohibits the weight of vehicles that would be enforceable, and people who have vehicles that weigh in excess of that amount would be stuck. And as long as those elements can be substantiated, there's some evidence to suggest that the building was designed with certain loads in mind, and that those loads contemplate the weight of vehicles of a certain amount, then that would be enforceable. So I don't know why the dynamic of what combustion engine the car has in it would change anything.
One solution is about spreading the weight out. Garages are already designed to have somewhat heavy vehicles show up. People have pickups, they could load them up with cinder blocks. But what we're talking about here is the future. If your owners all start showing up with electric vehicles, you're not going to be able to distribute that weight. And kind of getting back to distributing the weight, like if the engineering firm backs me up on this, it is about distributing the weight. Are associations going to be able to pick and choose who gets these premier spots? Are they going to be first come, first serve, or are they just going to have a blanket restriction?
As long as the rule's reasonable, then it would be enforceable. I think problematic questions would be, one, what do you do when a person has a deeded or a particular space assigned to him or her, and his 20,000 pound vehicle and charging station will cause a structural risk if it's parked there, will not raise a structural concern if that vehicle and charging station is parked on the other side of the building. So will the guy now have to move his deeded space from inside the building with 10 feet away from the front door and put it in another part of the parking garage where an engineer has opined that that's a safe place for heavier vehicles to go?
So you have a handicapped resident, they have an electric vehicle. Are they going to have to be provided with an accommodation in the parking garage? Are they going to have to be granted one of these premier spots? Are premier spots going to have to be held open for the aspect of future accommodation?
Why would a disabled guy who has an electric vehicle, why would the analysis be any different than a regular car? Because he's got a charging station also? Is that why?
No, the thinking is the individual with the electric vehicle is going to tell people, you can't park here anymore. You're going to have to make other arrangements. Yeah. So for the non-disabled people, okay, so that's an inconvenience, right? But for the disabled individual, that's more than an inconvenience if they can't park in the actual parking garage.
Assuming we all agree that the person is disabled, then the condominium has an obligation to make a reasonable accommodation.
I think it's going to get tricky as the electrical vehicles become more and more popular and more heavier. I think associations are going to have to figure out about allotting a certain amount of spaces that they may need for people for accommodations. Because what happens if someone shows up, they move in, there's no space for them? Are they just going to be told to hit the bricks?
Well, it depends on it would depend on what's reasonable. If an engineer tells you there's only 30 square feet that you can park a car, you can park this electric vehicle on without the building collapsing, and there are already disabled people parking there, I mean, that's the end of it.
My question is, what about if they're not disabled? You have 30 spots,
Right.
They've all been taken. It's a mix of disabled and non-disabled. A new disabled individual moves in.
Well, the disabled person gets an accommodation, which would be presumably the point of getting an accommodation would be to park closer to the front door. So you have to move other cars.
If the cost to retrofit or enhance some of these older parking garages are astronomical, but based on the increased popularity of electric vehicles, or even as they become mandated by the government, are associations going to be required to perform these enhancements?
Absent a special law that mandates existing housing facilities to upgrade their facilities, absent that, then the answer is probably no. But the legislature of a state could adopt a law that demands that every building in a state be supported such that it can take on an extra 1 million tons of weight. And then presumably even the most draconian legislature would give a condominium a certain number of years to do that. And then I guess the condominium would have to assess all its people or borrow all its money. I mean, but a legislature can do that. But I don't think a condominium could be indirectly forced because for some reason, some government decides that you can only drive an electric vehicle in X state. Indirectly, that wouldn't force necessarily the condominium to make the building sustainable for those cars. But I don't think the condominium would have some duty on it to improve the weight bearing ability because the government mandated the electric vehicles. But I think a state government could mandate a condominium to upgrade its load bearing capacity